And to all the folks. Oh, says it's recording now. Great. Thanks for organizing this, and to everyone who helped organize this, and also to everyone who is attending today. I'm optimistic to see that there's so many people being civically engaged now with the upcoming elections in May, which is when they're happening. The primaries are in May 17th. So I just want to introduce myself, share a little bit about my campaign, why I'm running, what I'm focused on in terms of my priorities. So the name is Shariah Mayfield. Most people say it wrong. It's Shariah. I'm an employment rights attorney. I do workers' rights type work, which really covers the gambit of anti-discrimination, anti-retaliation type cases. So people who have been mistreated at work on the basis of race, religion, ethnicity, sex, disability status, workers' comp status, situations like that. Wrongful discharge and wage labor type cases as well. That really is my passion, is fighting against sticking it to the man and standing up for employees who have been mistreated. By way of education and prior professional experience, I graduated from Stanford with an English degree, finished my studies at 20, which will explain why I have a lot of experience in the last 10 years of my life. Went on to Georgetown, got my JD there, worked for Senator Wyden in DC for a couple of years doing privacy and national security work, really pushing for privacy rights, helping on legislation like the USA Freedom Act, which was bicameral, bipartisan, successful legislation that curtailed mass surveillance. So if anyone's following sort of mass surveillance type issues, that's my bread and butter as well. I do teach privacy law at Willamette Law, and have been doing that. I think this is going to be my 6th term this year. After working for Senator Wyden for a couple years, I graduated from law school, went on to work at the Oregon Department of Justice under Attorney General Ellen Rosenblum, who I have a lot of respect for, did trial work there, represented the state in pretty much every case you could imagine, ODOT, OYA, OHA, the Education Department, just really all the agencies in all types of cases. Did appellate work doing criminal appeals. I helped decertify police officers who engaged in misconduct. I did civil commitment cases, which I think is relevant to my priorities here, and why I'm running. So my experience I draw heavily on in crafting policy and in crafting my priorities, which is really in sum focused on short-term emergency action to address our livability crisis. So that's really the spoiler alert. After working at the DOJ, I went into private work and really just did a little bit of everything, mostly employment rights, but also during COVID, I had to adapt. So I did some cannabis industry law, construction law, just really all over the board, but came back to employment rights again. And now I work downtown at Meyer Stevenson and own my own workers' rights firm. That's a huge introduction to who I am, or at least my professional background, but I believe it's relevant because it will explain my perspective in how I approach my policy. I'm also Egyptian American, Muslim, grew up in a Muslim family and faced a good deal of anti-Muslim bigotry growing up. For those of you who might know, my dad was wrongfully arrested in 2004 in connection to the Madrid train bombings. It was all over the news, based on a faulty fingerprint match, and also religious profiling, which I need to make that part clear, that the government even admitted, the FBI admitted that they had profiled our family, at least in part because of our religion. And so I have a zero tolerance stance on bigotry, on racism, on national origin, discrimination, xenophobia. And so even at my own firm, I'm very welcoming of undocumented immigrants and people from all backgrounds who have basically been otherized and have that sort of double consciousness. So to switch to my priorities, the real focus on why I'm running is because just to be quite frank, I didn't prepare these remarks, I'm just speaking off the cuff. I'm very disillusioned with the current leadership we have. For the last several years, the place that I was born in Portland, has gotten increasingly worse in terms of livability standards, safety, traffic, the homeless crisis, the amount of garbage on the streets, really just every aspect. We're 50th in the nation for drug addiction treatment, which to me is connected to our other crises. Mental health clearly is a priority here that needs to be addressed and is not being addressed with the scale of urgency that it needs to be addressed. So Really, my campaign is focused on damage control and dealing with the visible crises that we're seeing on our streets first and foremost. I believe that my opponents, particularly the commissioners who have been in power for 5 or more years, who are essentially now asking for a promotion to be chair, have not shown the type of leadership that gives me confidence that they're going to solve the problems, because not only have they not solved the problems over the last 5 years, the problems have gotten significantly worse to the point we now have the second highest unsheltered population in the United States as of a federal study last year, right after California. So things are only getting worse. And part of that is, and I won't go into the whole sort of bungled mess of politics and governance and city versus county versus state and how there's sort of disjointed responses. You know, one could say that the city is more focused on short-term solutions, and the county has been, in my opinion, almost exclusively focused on long-term solutions. And while those long-term solutions like permanent housing and affordable housing are important, we're dealing with an emergency. We've been in an emergency since 2015. The homeless crisis was declared an emergency. So this is not a new issue. We've been dealing with the homeless crisis for over 6 years, the homeless emergency for over 6 years. And we're seeing that the current county response, not only is it not working, I think it's exacerbating the problem. So what we really have to do is radically shift gears, move into a direction of what I consider as both common sense and tried and tested in other parts of the world. I have a model that's really focused on get people off the streets into any type of stable shelter, alternative housing, transitional housing. That's first and foremost before we start focusing on trying to get people into permanent housing, particularly if they have severe mental health issues or drug addiction issues. I did work with a group of a class of people who had severe mental health issues and drug addiction, substance abuse disorders when I did civil commitments, which is basically appeals, basically cases where people had to be involuntarily committed for treatment for dangerous mental illness. So some people don't understand civil commitment, but it really is only for people who are imminently dangerous to themselves or others, or can't provide for their basic needs. And that second part is important, not being able to provide for your basic needs. So I would urge everyone who's looking at their candidates who are running to ask them if those candidates know what Oregon Chapter 426 says. That's the chapter that deals with civil commitments and when you can get dangerously mentally ill people into treatment because that's what they need. If they don't know what Oregon Chapter 426 says, then I don't think they're actually geared and slated to solve our problems, because we will not solve the homeless crisis until we address the attendant mental health and substance abuse issues plaguing our streets. 49% of the people that died on the streets, according to the Domicile Unknown report, involved meth use. So we know in many years ago, it was only 3%. So this problem is exploding and getting worse. So what would I actually do? The first thing I would do as chair is create sanctioned camp areas. So we already have people camping on the streets in unsanitary conditions. I don't believe that that's human type of status quo. It's dangerous. They're at risk of assault, heightened risk of assault. They're in the elements. They're freezing, they're overheating to death. This should never happen in a developed country or developed city or county. It's egregious. And I won't call out specific commissioners as to their responses to some of this extreme weather crisis and people that are literally dying on the streets prematurely, but suffice to say, it hasn't been a big enough priority, because we should not have that many people suffering, dying in the ditch, on drugs, not getting the treatment that they need. So really what I'm focusing on is, number one, get everyone in sanctioned areas so that they can be connected to services, and we can have a named head count, and we can have better resource distribution. Knowing how many people there truly are on the streets is critical. And currently our point in time counts are not accurate. They're severe undercounts. I've met with the volunteers who count, Ecumenical Ministries, I've met with TPI, I've met with different folks, and what I've heard continually, and even Homer Williams is saying, he thinks it's at least 3 times the amount of the count. Alan Evans, who heads Bybee Lakes, said that when they were polling folks, this was at the P4P town hall, when they were polling folks from off the streets as to whether they'd ever been contacted by case management government workers, 66% said they hadn't been. So really a large chunk of the homeless population on the streets is not even being engaged by the case management workers. And that's a problem because you can't be helping these people unless you're actually engaging with them. So in my plan, we get everybody into the sanctioned camp areas first and foremost. We have people sleeping on sidewalks, sleeping right off the roads. It's not safe. Just yesterday, I believe, just recently, maybe the day before, in Salem, a drunk driver hit a homeless encampment and killed multiple people and injured multiple people. It's not safe for people to be right off the street like that. And just on I-205 exit, close to, not too far from where I live, down by Foster, another person was hit and killed off the side of the road. And so we know that this is deadly. We know it's not safe. And I think some people are pushing for this sort of perfect solution and this long-term solution at the expense of immediate action and getting people into at least some stable conditions, whether or not it's perfect. So get people into the sanctioned areas, connect them to services. At the very least, we need toilets, garbage services, sanitation, showers. Even if it's showers on wheels, they do that in Eugene, that's okay. We work with what we got, and we have to keep moving. And then when you have people in set areas, you can connect them to Social Security disability benefits. This is stuff that I deal with in my employment rights work. People on disability, it will take a few months. It's not going to be super fast, but it's important to connect anyone who is eligible to a steady income. That is very helpful in stabilizing people to have an earning potential at all. And so while Social Security disability benefits are not huge, SSDI is not a huge amount, it's something to help ease some of the local taxpayer burden, because we're absorbing a disproportionate amount of the taxpayer burden with people that are moving here in large numbers. It is a desirable area, although with recent livability issues, it's kind of not becoming as desirable as a destination, but we still do have influx of people coming here. We have homeless folks from across the country also coming here. And so we need the federal government to start picking up some of the tab and helping out. And that means getting people connected to their rightful income to which they are for which they are eligible. So that would be important to get them connected. Really enforcing, and yes, I do believe we need to enforce the camp bans at that point. When you have alternatives available, there has to be some level of enforcement. Ideally, we're working with people voluntarily. They move into the areas that work for them, and we have varied options. So in addition to the camp areas, which would be the very first thing I would be focusing on for damage control and resource distribution and garbage removal and giving them a fixed address, I would also be ramping up, and I do support shelter services, tiny homes, and RV parks and safe parks. So this is important to have, in my opinion, multiple options, because not all the people on the street are the same. And we know this, and anybody who works in homeless advocacy knows there are people with severe mental health or drug addiction issues. We need low barrier and high barrier options. For people that want sober living, we have sober options. And when I spoke with TPI, it sounds like a lot of the hesitation to go into the shelters could be remedied by mitigating concerns that should not be impossible to address. So whether it's cleanliness, whether it's safety issues, a lot of those issues can be addressed by having proper security, having proper hygiene standards. Some places that if they don't allow a pet, how do we have different options for people so that they will utilize the shelter options? Because I do support the shelter options, and I support the work of even the groups in this call today, this room, in getting people into transitional services so that they can stabilize, ideally get treatment, and then move on to independent permanent housing as the end goal. Knowing that some people may actually not be able to become self-sustaining and independent enough to have their own housing. Some people, unfortunately, because of their severe mental health issues, will have to be receiving wraparound services, particularly for a long time or possibly in some cases forever. And that's just a reality in my experience working in civil commitment. And then kind of a last point, which I'll address, mental health and drug addiction. This should be obvious in my opinion, but we should be ramping up multiple of these behavioral mental health resource centers. The one that's slated downtown is just the tip of an iceberg that has a couple hundred beds. We probably need a few thousand beds. And so I would be pushing to construct very quickly more behavioral mental health resource centers. And having done construction law, I know when I say quickly, it's going to take a long time. So we need to start doing that right now, immediately, so that when one opens, another one's on the way to open up, and another one's on the way, and dual diagnosis so that you can get mental health and drug addiction treatment at the same time. We shouldn't have people with these issues having to jump through hoops, and it's complicated, and the scheduling is difficult. And when you open up the call line, it's getting flooded, and there's not enough resources for everybody. This is a problem that I think a lot of people are fed up with, because I was one of the people that did vote to decriminalize small drug possession. I worked in the cannabis industry, and I don't think that the best place for people with drug addiction issues is jail. And I know that as well, because I did criminal defense work, and a lot of the folks I worked with were homeless and had primarily meth addiction. So knowing that jail is not going to rehabilitate these people long-term, and it's just going to put a strain on our carceral system, what we should be doing is getting these people into voluntary, easily accessible, as accessible as fast food, in my opinion, treatment. And for the people that are dangerous or violent and assaulting potentially other people, if they've committed crimes, they need to be arrested. That should be clear. But if they're about to commit a crime, or they're at risk of harming themselves because they're walking in the streets, they can't pay attention to what's going on around them due to their mental health or their substance abuse disorder, those people do need to be evaluated for civil commitment. And I actually support the work of Project Respond at the county level. I don't know if you guys have heard of them, but they are a great program that's been around for decades, but they're not very well known. And what they do is they link up clinicians with police officers, and they respond to mental health crises, kind of like Portland Street Response, which I also support, but they have trained law enforcement officers who will assist the clinician. If the clinician says this person is in a mental health crisis, they need to go to the hospital, the police officer is trained then to detain safely and take that person to a hospital so they can receive treatment. And from there, you can have judicial review to determine if the person needs to be civilly committed for longer term treatment. And that's where you would have the option for the Behavioral Resource Center and other mental health resource centers to help people stabilize and get treatment that they need, or medication if they need it. Ideally, we're trying to solve the root causes of the problem. If you throw somebody with severe mental health into housing without required treatment and services, what I've seen in my own experience is those people do go on to destroy property, burn down buildings. They're not aware of their surroundings. And I'm not saying everyone, but that will happen. It's not an if, it will. So when I see some advocates pushing for solutions, but not listening to folks that have worked in prison, law enforcement, criminal defense type spheres like myself, I'm very taken aback, because I'm saying my experience tells me that this is a problem and you're not addressing it. So I come in to my policy with that sort of ideology. And what I'll end with is basically to say that despite all of our problems, because these problems are not acceptable, we really, really deserve better. Everyone deserves better. Every person I've asked, it doesn't matter their religion, their age, their color, their race, their socioeconomic class. Every person I have asked has said their number one issue in this area is the homeless crisis, the homeless emergency not being dealt with. And so that really is at the front of my campaign. I do have other priorities. You're free to look at them at my website, votemayfield.com. But how to deal with pandemic anti-isolation efforts. I think in the UK, they have a minister of loneliness, or anti-isolation, anti-loneliness minister. We need to start thinking, how do we get people to heal and come together as a community as we emerge from this debilitating pandemic, and start focusing on overcoming division, overcoming incompetence, overcoming the fear and the chaos that has plagued our government and has not instilled confidence in the people. We need a leader who has vision, who has her eyes set on what do we need to do next? How do we get it done? If there's an obstacle, how do we get over it? And to be transparent with the people. And that's something I do promise that I will do. Is I'm not going to promise perfection, but I will promise urgent action, passion, putting pressure where it's needed, compromising if I need to. I'm not going to shove my heels in the ground and say my way or the highway. That's why I have so many varied responses. I really would urge everybody listening today to seriously scrutinize and consider the candidates running against me, who may be promising lots of action, but in my opinion, their track record has not shown a lot of follow through, and the streets speak for themselves. So if you're happy with the status quo, vote in somebody who's been part of the status quo. But if you want somebody different who's coming in with this passion and energy and accountability to the people, so that people know what's going on, where the taxpayer money is going, what is the government, what is a county chair? A lot of people don't even know that. And so really, I'm trying to bring it back to basics to really center my policy in what the silent majority, and I don't want to always use that term, but what the silent majority I think truly want, which is urgent action and results we can see. So that is where I'm coming from. I will push my absolute hardest to do that. It would be an honor to serve and be in public service to the people, and really prioritize focusing on the emergencies that people want us to focus on. So I'll leave it at that. I think it's been 20 minutes, and maybe we can switch to questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shariah, for explaining your plans for the candidacy.
Absolutely.
It's really enlightening.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're going to move on to questions. So we have a few already that people have sent in. But if you have a question, please enter it in the chat or raise your virtual hand. Leslie's going to monitor the chat and then send them to me like as they come in, and then I'll make sure to just like keep track of who's raising their virtual hand. So floor is open. Okay, I think I'll start with one of the questions asked by Madison from William Temple House. What will be your approach for leading initiatives to ensure the safety and well-being near and around Portland area schools? And I will copy and paste that into the chat.
Great question. So I'm going to focus primarily again on the livability crisis with the homelessness, drug addiction, and mental health. So one problem, and I don't know if this is what the person is getting at, is when we're crafting our short-term transitional housing options, such as tiny home villages, rest villages, shelters, and constructing new areas, or even sanctioned camp areas, for example, which I do support. I have not, and I do not believe that we should be putting these sites right next to schools. And there have been instances where I believe sites have been pushed for within just hundreds of feet of school. And the reality is people that have drug addiction issues and mental health issues, we shouldn't be putting people who need intensive services right next to schools, and we shouldn't allow encampments right next to schools. It's not safe. And it's not safe for the homeless either. The homeless folks outside, as you guys all know, are also at a high risk of facing assaults and crime and other activity. And so bringing that right next to a school is not ideal. And another problem, unfortunately, with putting, say, camps or rest villages next to schools without having proper knowledge of who's in those camps and not screening and having a head count, is you may have people with sex offender backgrounds being placed next to a school, which actually is against zoning laws. It's against the law. And so unless we're actually screening properly, there's increased risk to those children, and I do not support that. So really addressing the drug crisis will be critical to addressing safety at schools. So another part of that would be, in my opinion, this is not the jurisdiction of the county chair, but we really do need to be cracking down in terms of law enforcement on deadly drug dealers of fentanyl, which is now becoming a problem at our schools. I think 2 kids recently died from fentanyl, and that's unacceptable and really sad and tragic. So really focusing on addressing our drug emergency. I think we need to declare this an emergency. And I just went to Harriet Tubman Middle School about a week ago, and right behind the school, as many of you guys can see off the highway, was a gigantic camp that was abandoned and had garbage all over, and there was drug paraphernalia, and we know that there's drug paraphernalia there. So the people that are sounding the alarm about these issues, I think, are correct. We need to listen to parents. They do not feel safe putting safe rest villages and places with intensive services needed right next to a school, and I would agree with that. There are other areas. We have about 60 lots that we can choose from what I've seen, and we don't need to be putting schools and children at risk of the attendant issues that come along with people who have severe mental health and drug addiction issues.
Thank you.
Sure.
Looks like we have a raised hand from Andy, so I'm going to unmute you, Andy.
Thanks, Sarah. Hey, great to see everybody here today. Thanks for coming out, and really excited about kicking off this series of conversations. Shariah, thanks for your passion for being here today and for kicking us off.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just got a follow-up question about homeless services, kind of a two-part question.
Sure.
The first part is I'd be interested to hear from you and what you think is driving the spike in the homeless population. What do you think is behind that? And then I'm interested, and I understand when people think about homelessness, they think about shelter. I get that. That is a logical connection. I think the big question I'm tackling is what do we do next? How do we make sure that shelter isn't the end of the line? What is really the solution for moving folks into more permanent housing? I read your 5-point plan. I don't see any mention of housing, and I'm sure you have ideas about that. So I'd love to get your feedback or perspective on those questions.
Sure. So let me just remember the first question before I get carried away. So the first question was on, can I get a little refresher on that? So I had the second question in my mind.
Yeah, for sure. Two-parters. So the first part is you've mentioned drug abuse and mental health issues. Do you see that as what is driving a homeless spike, or what do you see as driving?
Yeah. Yes. Great question. I mean, I think the more superficial explanation is poverty. We're having an increase in poverty here. And what's causing that is a combination of factors. It's the mental health crisis. It's the drug addiction crisis. Largely, I think the drug addiction crisis is really up there as one of the top, because people who have severe mental health and drug addiction issues are less likely to be able to be self-sustaining. Obviously, the rise in housing cost is a huge part of it as well. I mean, rent here has skyrocketed with the influx of people moving here. And even with some rent control regulations in place, which kind of happened more recently, we're still seeing people getting phased out of having lived here potentially their whole lives. It's too expensive. So the reality is we do have an affordable housing crisis. And so I do continue to support, you mentioned kind of housing, I do continue to support the long-term solution. So I'm really just saying, let's leave that alone. Let's continue to construct affordable housing units, expand HUD, get people into permanent housing if they're able. But really the homeless crisis, which is connected but somewhat separate, is, in my opinion, more geared towards stabilizing and rehabilitating people who have behavioral issues. And in certain studies, I don't have the exact study in front of me, I believe it was 92% of people had either behavioral, mental health, or drug addiction issues who are homeless. And so that's something that has to be dealt with. What's the underlying cause of all of that? If we were to dig even deeper, from my experience doing criminal defense and being in working with prisoners and doing habeas cases, many times those people who do have drug addiction issues and mental health, and often criminal records as well, come from backgrounds with childhood abuse and trauma and neglect. And so really, really at the root of the problem, in my opinion, is a lack of community support. So that would be starting from day one, from the day you're born to the day you graduate from high school or college or whatever system where you're in getting education and where you have a sense of hopefully community. We should be supporting people at every phase, in schools, in after school programs, in faith communities. If you're a part of a faith community, extracurriculars, we need to be ensuring that people are actually getting support that they need and coming together as a community. And this is more of just my personal view. I can't say that I have the pure statistics on this, or and I'm sure there probably are statistics, but as people tend to become more disconnected, it's a lot easier for somebody to slip through the cracks. And a lot of people cannot bear the brunt anymore of even helping other family members or close friends who have fallen on hard times. So if you fall on hard times now, everyone else is struggling. They may not have a place for you on their couch. They may not have an extra bedroom for you. So you might end up more likely on the streets than, say, 20 years ago when people had the capacity to help out more. Too many people are struggling. And we have an economic crisis that's exploding with stagnant wages, high tuition costs. These are huge problems that I will not be able to solve as county chair. Really, what I'm trying to do is just damage control. So yes, we do need to keep focusing on the long-term solutions. And I support a model that's similar to Amsterdam, where you have a stepping stone type progress to independent housing. So at each phase, as you go from potentially shelter to tiny home, or it could be, you could skip over some of these steps. But at some point you should be getting into roommating type situations, subleasing, renting, and ideally from there, some people are stuck there their whole lives, but ideally into your own permanent housing. So it's really just moving your way up this ladder, kind of like we see in some European, they call them actually housing first models, which is interesting. I'm not on the term housing first because it's not first, but it is something that would end up being the end goal once people are self-sustaining. And that's the key part. Once you're able to take care of yourself and have your mental health, drug addiction treated, then you can be in a place where you can actually be self-sustaining. But what I don't think is sustainable or even feasible with our budget, it actually is not feasible, is to just put anybody into independent housing, permanent housing. There's no attendant requirements, and there's no plan to ensure that they will get rehabilitated if possible. If it's voluntary, there's no guarantee. So I do continue to support the addressing zoning laws, creating more affordable housing, but my really huge focus is on emergency action right now to get people into some sort of fixed address. Okay.
Thank you. Okay, we have a few questions. I will call them in the time that they were given. So the first one is from Lior, second is from Vicky, and then Tim, I see you with your raised hand, so we'll get to you. So Lior Schweitzer from Portland Tenants United asked, and you can see it in the chat, it says, tenants' rights are usually determined at the state level and most recently at the city level too. Lack of tenant protections leading to displacement are a major driver of houselessness. How do you envision the county stepping in to protect tenants from displacement?
Great question. So I do promote a home share type program at the county level, which is kind of similar to Oregon Harbor for Hope, which is a private sector program, but basically it would be kind of like a roommate linking, almost like how you have Craigslist and you can find a roommate. It would be a roommate linking service where the county could screen tenants and landlords and provide mediation and conflict resolution free of charge to small mom and pop landlords who decide to participate. So if you're a small mom and pop, and let's say you have a house and you just want to rent out a room in your own home, but you're worried about, well, what if the tenant doesn't pay? What if they have issues and now I have to evict them, but it's taking several months? The county program would provide assurances to both the tenant and the landlord and give some rent assistance support to the tenant, which would prevent evictions and displacement. So for example, just like we had the pandemic, a lot of people fell on hard times. They issued declarations of hardship or an affidavit of hardship saying, I declare that I've faced a huge hardship. Here's some supporting documents. I need rental assistance. We should continue programs like that through this county home share program and apply it to people so it won't get abused, but to people who truly have been consistently working and responsible, but just fell through the cracks for a month or two, to be able to provide them rental support and also give assurance to the landlord. It's a lot cheaper to prevent homelessness than to deal with it once it already happens. So this is sort of a preventative measure where people can get that help. Or if they can't pay for a security deposit, some people, especially teenagers, 18, 19, can't get into any housing. And this includes people who have faced bullying, LGBT people, any young person who's trying to find their own housing and doesn't have credit and doesn't have a longstanding job history is going to have a difficult time. So that's where the county can really also step in because a lot of people who either have been in foster care or had behavioral issues growing up, they're going to have a hard time getting housing and there's a higher chance they're going to end up homeless. So we really need to be preventing by providing county assurances, rent assistance, and that also incentivizes more small landlords to open up their rooms in their own homes and open up roommating type situations, which is the cheapest type of housing we can be supporting. In one study, I believe, if 2% of the people in the whole Portland metro region, homeowners, opened up a room in their house, it would open up to 20,000 units. So why don't we work with the existing infrastructure so that we can immediately start to get people into cheaper housing, especially working class folks who just can't afford their own housing independently because it's just too expensive right now.
And our next question is from Vicky Wolf. Vicky lives in the Roseway Madison neighborhood. There have been 4 gun-related deaths off of 82nd in the last 8 months. There has been disinvestment in our neighborhood and more businesses are leaving. What is your strategy regarding investments along Northeast and Southeast 82nd?
Great question. And I also want to extend my sympathies to the gentleman who was just very recently killed. Actually, a Muslim African-American man was shot and killed at 82nd and Milton. And so the gun violence problem is out of control. As you guys may know, the county chair, again, doesn't have jurisdiction over PPB or even the sheriff, but I have supported reform to the police and accountability processes in actually implementing a grievance process within the police force so that people who have been mistreated could kind of go through the police force and report misconduct. At the same time, I do support law enforcement gun reduction type teams, gun violence reduction teams. We need to reinstate that. We need to start putting funding into gun violence response and anti-gun violence law enforcement teams. And one way to start addressing that is to restore what we had before. Again, that should be coupled with reform and with accountability over the police. But what we have right now is not sustainable. We have record gun violence, gun deaths, traffic deaths. So we are going to need some form of law enforcement to deal with the most dangerous people in the society, namely criminals, people that are murdering others, and those who are increasing our gun violence in the region. So I think law enforcement needs to play a huge role in addressing the gun violence. Otherwise, we have more people dying, and actually disproportionately BIPOC people are the ones being bearing the brunt of the gun violence. And so we need to make sure that everyone's safe here. And yes, that means through using police and possibly more creative ideas of the sheriff's office. Some people have shared the idea of possibly having the sheriff address some of these issues and working jointly with the police. I'm open to hearing more ideas on that, but just as chair, because I don't have jurisdiction over that, I wouldn't say for certain that I would commit to that particular type of joint task force.
Okay, thank you. And now I'm gonna unmute Tim so you can ask his question.
Hi.
Hi.
I have a kind of a two-part question. I just want you to speak a little bit to the sort of, I don't know, dissonance I saw between your stance on providing a lot of community solutions and getting people assistance and stuff, but then also this sort of deference to law enforcement. At TPI, we've had 7 of our participants in the past 3 years that were murdered by police while in mental health crisis. And that's just people that receive services at TPI. So I wanted to speak to that a bit. And then also in terms of our services and all these social service agencies that that the county turns to for work in this field, we have a crisis of losing employees because they're not getting paid. They're going homeless themselves. I mean, they're not getting a livable wage, and I would like to hear what you would do about that.
Sure. So as to your first question on the police, again, I think the gun reduction team is something separate that really does need to be reinstituted and to start dealing with gun violence. The mental health crisis and the issues that we've had with police force not being properly trained to respond to mental health crisis and actually resulting in deaths sometimes and bad outcomes. It's why I do support, like I said, Project Respond when it comes to mobile mental health crisis units, because what that allows is for the clinician to make the assessment, not the police officer. Police officers aren't trained to make assessments with regard to somebody's mental health status and their drug addiction issues. So that's why I really do think we need to have these paired up teams responding when it comes to calls that involve mental health crises. That would prevent a large chunk of the police using their own judgment on things that they're not well trained to deal with. And the reality is, the unfortunate reality is, because our drug addiction issue and mental health issue has been, in my opinion, neglected to be dealt with. We're 50th for drug addiction treatment. The police are dealing with something they should have never been tasked with dealing with, which is the mental health crisis dereliction of duty at our government level to address it. So that's really the symptom of a failure to actually address the underlying mental health crisis that we're dealing with behavioral mental health resource centers, with dual diagnosis centers, with using, supposedly it was supposed to be the cannabis tax to do rehabilitation in tandem with the drug decriminalization. But what we got was, we decriminalized the drugs. Now we have a permissive drug culture, but we don't have the attendant rehabilitation that was promised with the drug decriminalization. And so I think that's the problem. Even when you look at places like Portugal, they have a lot of rehabilitation and treatment that goes along with the drug decriminalization. And I keep talking about drugs because they're very connected to the mental health crisis we're facing. Now, and I also want to remind everyone that we have had dozens of people dying on the streets. And as I said before, almost half of those are because of meth addiction or meth use. So there are more people dying on the fringes of society right now without having interventions. And so that to me is quite a huge problem. As to your second point on how do we keep these people from becoming themselves, and that is a larger problem that, again, I don't think that the county chair will have a perfect solution to. What we do is we fund and we have procurements to these groups, nonprofits, shelters that are working on solving the issue, and they do need to be adequately funded, or like you're saying, they're going to start going off and doing their own things. Even with the Safe Rest villages, if we don't listen to the concerns of the nonprofits saying, hey, here are the resources we need to actually run this program, I wouldn't really blame them for getting out of the field or leaving. So there were concerns about the Safe Rest villages, security issues, things like that wasn't being dealt with. So it would come from proper funding to the relevant agencies and nonprofits that are making headway in addressing our homeless crisis. And the ones that are making headway, and I actually respect a lot the services of TPI, the ones that are making headway in Blanchet House and all these other ones, they need to continue getting funding and continue doing what they're doing to provide the services. And if they say, hey, this is what we need to keep the lights on, we need to look at them. And of course, we need to look carefully line by line, where's the money going? But if they're saying this is what we need to also have some deference to the folks on the ground dealing with these issues.
Thank you. Our next question is from Kylie Euthus at Transition Projects. She asks, do or will you support the 3,000 challenge?
You know, I'm not entirely, I'm not going to say I'm super supportive of it. I don't think it's feasible in terms of monetary. In fact, it was Dr. Zapata, I believe, had posted a tweet recently. I believe it was on March 8th. And then Katrina Holland of Join retweeted it. And in it, it said something to the effect of 116 beds would cost $19 million. And she had posted a whole bunch of housing options with purchase prices. So with 116 beds for $19 million, and this is just one example, this was somebody that's supporting the 3,000 challenge, that would be about $160,000 per person to get into the permanent housing. And that's not feasible. And we can't scale that to the amount of homeless people on the streets, which if it truly is about 3 times the point in time count, possibly more, then we only have about $10,000 per person on the street. So just looking at our budget, I would like that we could do more of that ideally, but in reality, I don't think it's feasible financially beyond a small amount of people. So I would say I'm somewhat neutral about it. I hope that it works out and I hope that they can help some people. But in terms of the 20,000 homeless people, what would happen if we did that large scale is some people would get a lot, they would get nice housing, and some people, a lot of people would get nothing. And so I would rather everyone get a little bit of something than some people get a lot and then a lot of people get nothing and people continue to stay out on the streets. So I will say that I support their vision and I hope that they have success, because I do ultimately want more people off the streets as well and getting independent housing in the long term. But financially, I don't think it's feasible.
Okay, thanks. So we have 10 minutes and 3 questions.
Okay.
Let's see if we can get all of them answered, but if
Sure.
not, we will send them to you afterwards.
Sure.
Okay, so this question is from Victoria. Many folks who are houseless have gone through our systems, through shelters and even housing. As far as emergency response goes, how would you address folks who do not want to re-enter shelter or even a tiny community due to traumatic events that have occurred in their past? Many folks feel safer on the street in their tent than in a space where they are forced to relive traumatic events and have no interest in accessing mental health services or community resources. I think trust and support is something that may be lacking. So how would you feel that? How would you create that?
Yeah, I think that's why we create zoned camp areas for people that do want to camp. I think I spoke to a homeless camper and she said about 40% would prefer to continue camping. And while that bewilders me personally, the fact that there are people that would prefer that due to having their own items, not having to have their items confiscated, being able to set up your architecture tents how you want, having those in streamlined areas, in zoned areas, allows for us to do streamlined services, to get garbage removal and so on. I think if you have trauma and you're just sleeping wherever in public, that is a problem. That's something that I'm trying to address in this campaign. We can't have people with severe mental health issues refusing any services at all, but also insisting that they can camp wherever. And that causes a burden on everyone else with garbage pileups, with biohazards, with people dying prematurely. It's not safe to just, have this right to die in the ditch. I don't believe in that. So I would say if they don't want to be in sort of curfewed areas with lots of rules and regulations that cause them trauma, and they don't want to get help for their trauma, at the very least, we allow them areas where they can camp with access to hygiene, sanitation services, low barrier type zoned areas, and some that would be high barrier for those that are able to meet the high barrier entry requirements.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
And then one question from Shirley Rogers. Do you have any strategy for helping a current successful renter whose primary income is Social Security and does not have funds for a down payment to become an owner?
I don't. I'll just say no, I don't. I wish that we could have something like that, but no plans on that. But I would be open if somebody has an idea on how we might be able to fund something like that at a county level, and how that might work. I don't have a plan for that.
Okay, thanks. We are nearing the end and I don't see any more questions. Leslie, have I answered all of them?
Yes, so far all of the questions in the chat have been answered.
Okay, great, thank you. Great, so looks like we're nearing the end. We only have 8 minutes left. Shariah, do you have any final words that you want to share?
Sure. I mean, I just want to reiterate, thanks everyone for coming and also for asking questions, and even hard questions. I want to kind of emphasize that I don't have every single answer, but what I do have is a vision for people who want short-term action and to do it quickly. I have a track record of getting things done, of actually showing success in what I commit to. Even though I am the youngest candidate, I have a track record of success. So I want to kind of iterate that I may not have every single answer, and I may not have answers that everybody agrees with. That's the thing. We're dealing with a complex issue where there's multiple talking heads and multiple ideas being thrown at the same problem. But ultimately, we just need something that works and that gets people off the streets. And so if you're supporting the housing first kind of absolutist model, I wish those people the best, but I'm really trying to be pragmatic here, focus on our budget, focus on getting as many people, as much help as possible, as quickly as possible, and raising the floor. So really just getting everybody up a little bit rather than getting some people up a lot and leaving a lot behind, which is what's happening when we have these permanent solutions that really don't scale to the crisis that we have right now. So I hope that if anybody wants to support, as far as the 3,000 challenge, the cost of moving into is less than the cost of operating shelters. I'd be glad to talk more about costs and comparing them. So if somebody wants to reach out to me separately, feel free. Like I said, based on just that one join tweet, that's 130,000. Another one came out recently where they said it would cost closer to, I believe, 47 to 52,000. Still, those numbers I don't think are scalable right now. So we could either increase the budget massively, which would probably require more taxes, or we can start on the ladder program, which is similar, or a stepping stone type program, which is similar to what, like I said, Amsterdam does. What many civilized parts of the world, developed parts of the world are doing is handling this in a raise the floor type manner. And I have not seen success here locally in the emphasis on the exclusive emphasis on permanent housing, which again, I think it's fine, but I don't think it's going to deal with the emergency we have right now. If we can get, because I did construction law, we can't get 20,000 people off the street, or even a few thousand people off the streets within a few months using Housing First. But we can get people using the sanctioned camp areas off the streets, thousands of them, within a few months, if we do it with the willpower that we need to get people just up one step. So again, I'm glad to talk more to folks who have feedback, who have questions. I do really try to listen to everyone. And if somebody truly does have a better idea that is scalable and that works with our budget and can show me actual success and long-term success with that sort of plan, please provide it to me. I will change my mind. I am not going to just say I'm right no matter what. So I am open, but I also have researched this immensely myself for the past several months to come up with the plans I've had. So they're not coming out of a vacuum or out of thin air as well. And I would love to meet with any of the groups that are in the room. So if anybody is part of one of the hosts today and their work for one of the hosts today, please reach out to me. And I'll just kind of share my website if anyone wants to go to it, but it's pretty simple. It's just votemayfield.com. And on there you can get involved. If you're inspired, you can contact me, you can leave a message. You can say, hey, I want to volunteer. We have a lot of opportunities right now. We have dozens of volunteers actually working on the campaign. So please do consider getting involved or donating if you really want this urgent change. And if you're skeptical, please reach out to me and share your concerns as well.
Thank you. We did have one more question that came in a little late, but
okay.
we only have 4 minutes late. If you think you can answer it now,
Sure.
please do, but otherwise I'll email it to you.
I can do it.
Oh, okay, cool. He says, what is your stance on enforcement of the no camping laws?
I would support enforcing, particularly on sidewalks and throwaways and passageways. So I think it's not safe to have people camping on sidewalks and other shared public spaces, but that would be in connection with alternative options. And so, and ideally multiple options, like I've said before. And so we would have sanctioned camp areas with services, tiny home villages, RV parks, and shelter, which is kind of the traditional shelter. Go to somebody who's camping on a sidewalk and say, hey, here are your options. Please choose one of these. And we would work with them voluntarily. I think a lot of homeless people would actually be willing to take up one of those options, especially if they want to just continue camping, then go to a zoned area that is set to have resources for camping. If they still say, no, I refuse to move off the sidewalk or off the street and I want to stay here. No, I do think that's where we need enforcement at that point. And how we do that humanely and whether we, allow them to take their items and their goods with them, that's a separate question. But I do think there has to be enforcement because a world laws are without enforcement are just recommendations. And I don't think we live in a world of recommendations. We live in a world of laws. I mean, I'm a lawyer. So if you have a law that says this is unsafe, this is biohazardous, this is causing disruptions to the rest of civil society and our social contract, the people outside also have civic duties as well. They're not, they're not infants. These are people that are adults, they're human beings, and they also are part of the social contract. And so you have duties and responsibilities. And that means if there are lots of options and you refuse to go to it, that's becoming a choice instead of purely a circumstance. And so, yes, I would support enforcing no camp bans when there are alternatives available and start with the sidewalks.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we've reached the end, everyone. Thanks for showing up. Thank you so much, Shariah, for giving us the opportunity to hear your stance and about your candidacy.
Thank you.
We will make sure that this recording is available following this cafe, and we are having future cafes with some other candidates. So make sure to check out our website, and I think Garrett will also be emailing stuff out about that pretty soon. So
thank you so much for
everybody.
hosting and everyone for coming. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Take care.
Bye.